April 2024, a NASA scientist named Chad Green is reviewing radar images of the Greenland ice sheet, data meant to measure how fast the ice is melting. Buried more than 100 feet down, something answers back. Straight lines, parallel corridors. Geometry that ice does not produce on its own. He's not looking at bedrock, he's looking at a city. A city the United States government built in secret, hid inside a glacier, and quietly hoped the world would forget existed. It almost worked. For over 60 years it did. The story starts in 1959, at the height of a Cold War that had no front lines, only proximity. The shortest path for a nuclear missile between the United States and the Soviet Union did not run across an ocean. It ran over the top of the world, across the Arctic. Whoever controlled a base near the pole controlled the fastest possible strike time on the planet. Greenland sat exactly there, an island the size of a small continent, covered in ice nearly 2 miles thick and controlled by Denmark. A missile base hidden under moving ice, with no fixed coordinates for an enemy satellite to lock onto, could theoretically survive a first strike and still launch a retaliatory one, a decisive edge in the strategic math of the era. Denmark, however, had a firm public policy. No nuclear weapons on Danish soil, no exceptions. For American war planners, this was not a boundary. It was a problem to be engineered around. The solution was to build something so unassuming that nobody, not even the country hosting it, would ask the right questions. The US Army called it Camp Century, and on paper it was almost charming. A traveling press corps was invited in 1960. The Saturday Evening Post ran a glowing feature. Camp Century was presented as a peacetime engineering marvel, a demonstration city proving that soldiers and eventually scientists could live comfortably on the polar ice cap indefinitely. It had dormitories for 200 men, a mess hall, a hospital, a barbershop, a chapel, a theater, and a library. It even had hot showers, a small miracle 800 miles from the North Pole. None of this was fabricated, all of it was real. It was also almost entirely beside the point. The engineering behind Camp Century was genuinely remarkable, and this is worth understanding before the deception underneath it. Army engineers used a method called trench and cover. Massive trenches were cut directly into the snowpack using rotary plows, then roofed over with archwood steel, then left to be buried naturally under new snowfall. Everything, the plows, the steel arches, the generators, the reactor components, had to be flown or hauled in from Thule Air Base roughly 140 miles away across terrain that swallowed vehicles and buried supply routes overnight. Within 2 years, despite that, the Army had carved 21 of these tunnels into the ice, totaling nearly 9,800 feet, almost 2 miles of underground corridor. The largest corridor, nicknamed Main Street, ran over 1,000 feet, wide enough to drive vehicles through. Above, the surface looked untouched, an unbroken sheet of white, with wind chill regularly dropping past minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit and darkness lasting for months at a time. Below, an entire small town hummed with generators, plumbing, and foot traffic, soldiers walking to breakfast in shirt sleeves while a polar night raged outside a roof made of packed snow. Powering all of it was the detail that made Camp Century historically unique. In 1960, the Army installed the PM-2A, the world's first portable nuclear reactor designed to prove that a self-contained power plant could be flown in pieces to the most remote military posting on Earth and assembled on site. It worked. Just 44 pounds of enriched uranium replaced what would have otherwise required more than 1 million gallons of diesel fuel shipped in by convoy across some of the most hostile terrain in the world. As a piece of Cold War engineering, judged purely on its own terms, Camp Century was a triumph. As cover for what it was actually built to enable, it was even more effective because Camp Century was never really the project. Camp Century was the prototype. The real program was called Project Iceworm, and its ambition was almost too large to process. The plan called for a network of tunnels stretching across roughly 4,000 kilometers of the Greenland ice sheet, a subsurface war machine capable of hiding and launching up to 600 nuclear missiles aimed at the Soviet Union. 4,000 kilometers is roughly the driving distance from New York to Los Angeles and back, except every mile of it would have been carved into a moving glacier and hidden from satellites. The missiles would be moved constantly between launch points beneath the ice, making them nearly impossible for Soviet reconnaissance to target in a first strike. Camp Century existed to prove the concept worked, that you could excavate livable operational infrastructure inside a moving glacier and keep it running. If the demonstration succeeded, the tunnels would multiply, quietly, for decades, underneath an ally that had explicitly banned nuclear weapons from its territory. Denmark's own government was not read in. Not the foreign ministry, not the officials overseeing Greenland. The country whose ice sheet was being hollowed out for a secret missile network had no idea it was happening. If you're finding this one interesting, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep digging up stories like it. The truth did not surface through a leak, a whistleblower, or an intelligence failure. It surfaced through paperwork, In 1997, researchers from the Danish Institute of International Affairs, compiling a historical study on Greenland's role in the Cold War, worked through a batch of declassified American documents and found a memo describing Camp Century as the pilot phase of a much larger subsurface missile network. Danish historians had spent decades assuming Camp Century was exactly what the brochure said it was. It was not. For the first time, Denmark learned that an American nuclear weapons program had been designed to operate on its territory without its consent, and had stayed hidden for more than 3 decades after the base itself had already closed. Because by 1997, Camp Century was already long dead, and it had died for a reason nobody in Washington had fully accounted for: ice moves. It was not supposed to move fast enough to matter within the operational lifespan of the base, but Greenland's glacier does not sit still. It flows, slowly crushing and shifting everything embedded inside it. Army glaciologists working at Camp Century began pulling ice cores for research, and noticed the tunnel ceilings were sagging faster than engineers had modeled. The projections were unambiguous and alarming. Within roughly 2 years, the moving ice would deform the tunnels enough to crush the structures built inside them. A missile network designed to be permanent and redundant could not survive contact with the one force nobody had adequately planned for: the glacier itself. Project Iceworm was quietly abandoned. Camp Century's nuclear reactor was removed in 1963. The remaining garrison pulled out by 1965. In 1966, the site was closed for good and left to the ice, the way you might abandon a car in a snowstorm, assuming nature will simply finish the job of erasing it. That same ice coring program left behind its own footnote, one that would take over 50 years to matter. In 1966, as Camp Century's glaciologists drilled downward to study how fast the ice sheet was moving, the drill kept going, through roughly 4,550 feet of solid ice, until it finally struck the ground underneath Greenland itself, pulling up a core of frozen soil, gravel, and sediment from the bedrock below. The sample was crated, shipped back, cataloged, and then, in the way military research often works, essentially forgotten. It sat in a freezer in Denmark for decades until researchers cleaning out cold storage rediscovered it in 2017. When scientists finally examined the bottom few feet of that sediment in 2019, they found something with no business surviving under 2 miles of supposedly permanent ice: freeze-dried twigs, leaves, and moss, plant material preserved by the cold well enough to identify under a microscope. The fossils meant one thing: at some point within the last million years, quite possibly within the last few 100,000, the ice sheet burying Camp Century had not existed at all. A missile program built on the assumption that Arctic ice was a permanent, unchanging fortress had by accident drilled up the proof that the fortress had melted away before and would again. For decades that assumption held. What the Army left behind at Camp Century did not vanish. It was simply buried deeper as new snow accumulated year after year, compressing into more ice above the old tunnels. And what was left behind was not trivial. The reactor itself was removed, but its operational waste was not. Camp Century's power plant had generated an estimated 47,000 gallons of radioactive wastewater over its operating life, discharged into a cavity carved into the ice sheet and simply sealed there. Alongside it sat an estimated 200,000 liters of diesel fuel, industrial PCBs, and roughly 24 million liters of untreated sewage from the base's own sanitation system, all of it entombed under what engineers in 1960 assumed was permanent, essentially eternal ice. No treaty governs who is responsible for cleaning up a weapons program that was never officially acknowledged to exist on foreign soil in the first place, a legal gap that Denmark and the United States have never fully resolved. In 2016, a team of scientists modeling Greenland's ice sheet under continued climate change concluded that eternal was the wrong word. Their study warned that if current melting trends continued, the ice covering Camp Century's buried waste could begin to thin enough to expose it as early as the year 2090, releasing radioactive material, fuel, industrial chemicals, and raw sewage into Greenland's meltwater system. The very ice sheet the Army had once treated as a limitless, self-sealing vault was now being tracked by climate scientists as a countdown, which brings the story back to April 2024 and Chad Green's radar images. NASA was not looking for Camp Century. Its aircraft was flying roughly 150 miles inland from the former Thule Air Base, testing an advanced airborne radar called UAVSAR to map the internal layers of the Greenland ice sheet, gathering exactly the kind of data that feeds warnings like the 2016 waste study. Instead of clean bedrock, the radar returned sharp, unmistakably artificial geometry, straight parallel lines running for hundreds of feet, buried more than 100 feet beneath the surface. Cross-referencing the coordinates against old military survey maps confirmed it immediately. This was Camp Century, seen with more structural clarity than at any point since it was abandoned, found entirely by accident, by the same warming climate that had made its buried contents dangerous in the first place. There's a strange symmetry sitting underneath all of this. Camp Century was engineered from its first trench to disappear, to be swallowed by snow and forgotten by history, along with the missile network it was quietly built to justify. For a long time, the ice cooperated. It buried the tunnels. It buried the reactor's waste. It very nearly buried the truth about Project Iceworm along with them. If not for a stack of paperwork, a group of Danish historians happened to keep pulling at. Now the same climate forces that were supposed to seal Camp Century away forever are the ones bringing it back into view. First as a warning on a scientist's spreadsheet, then as a ghostly outline on a radar screen. A base built to be invisible has become one of the most literal ticking clocks of the nuclear age, sitting under a mile of ice that is now, for the first time since 1959, running out. Somewhere beneath that ice, the reactor's waste, the diesel, the sewage, and the answer to exactly when it all resurfaces are still waiting, no longer hidden by secrecy, only by time. If a story like this deserves to be told, hit like, subscribe for more forgotten military history, and let me know in the comments what you think happens when that ice finally melts.